finally. Can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, cool. So, how's everything over there?
Chaos.
How so?
We're in the last week of the semester, but also we're in the process of moving, and everything had to happen all at once.
Oh, sorry. Appreciate for your time, man. Really sorry for bothering at this moment.
Oh, it's fine. I know we've been trying to do this for a while, so glad we were able to do it.
Yeah, appreciate it. So, is COVID okay over there?
Yeah, we're all back on campus, or we've been on campus for a long time, and we just removed our mask mandate not too long ago, so we're pretty much back to normal here.
That's cool. That's cool. So, first of all, I know you've been here before, but still, can you introduce yourself for the coaches in Taiwan?
Yeah, sure. Tim Suchomel, working as an associate professor at Carroll University in Wisconsin. Got my PhD in sport physiology and performance with Mike Stone at East Tennessee State. Handful of years ago, working as the kind of resident sports scientist here at Carroll University, in addition to my teaching. Most of my research has to do with strength and power development, various methods when it comes to weightlifting derivatives, but also explosive jumps, AEL, etc.
Cool. So today I kind of want to talk about weightlifting derivative and eccentric training. Okay?
Sure.
So first of all, I read a lot about your research, and can you talk a little bit about why should athletes train weightlifting?
Well, there's a variety of reasons that we can use weightlifting movements as kind of a training stimulus, but I will point out that we don't have to necessarily use them, but it is a great tool to have in our toolbox just because of all the benefits that we can get. So just to summarize some of them, we can develop postural strength in different positions. So any sport requires postural strength. It allows us to train the triple extension of the hip, knee, and ankle joints, which is predominant in every single sport as well. Probably the most common movement in sports is that triple extension, whether it's jumping, sprinting, change of direction, etc. So finding tools that will allow us to enhance that ability, whether it's the strength in the position or the explosiveness in that position, is going to be beneficial. It's very easy to overload weightlifting movements in the sense of adding weight to them and moving a moderate or heavy load quickly. So weightlifting derivatives compared to other methods of training allow us to receive those benefits. So compared to traditional training, which is kind of your squats, presses, pulls, weightlifting movements come out on top. Compared to jump training, they have a broader range of benefits, weightlifting derivatives do, compared to jumps. But again, we can also improve things like sprint performance and just specificity in terms of the movements that we can get with weightlifting movements.
So, I know you've done a catch versus non-catch weightlifting, right? Research, right?
Yeah.
So, on catches versus non-catching, why do you think we should train the catch and non-catch?
Yeah, I think individuals can easily train them both. I'd say catching in terms of teaching takes a little bit more time to learn, especially with a novice athlete who's never done it before. That being said, there's benefits to both catching and pulling. From the catching standpoint, the ability to receive an external load, kind of going from zero load to a moderate to moderately heavy load quickly is going to enhance kind of our load acceptance rate of force development or braking rate of force development, which is obviously important. The ability to transition from concentric to eccentric and kind of sequencing that movement is certainly a benefit as well. Obviously, the intent of the movement has to be there when people are performing a catching movement. So there's a number of benefits. Obviously, you'll receive strength benefits in those positions once you catch the bar as well. From a pulling perspective, we have a broader range of loads that we can prescribe and still get maximal effort. The benefit of weightlifting pulling derivatives, i.e. those that remove the catch phase, is we can program really heavy loads over our 1RM of a catching movement. So movements such as the mid-thigh pull, the counter movement shrug, pull from the floor, whether it's a clean or snatch grip, pull from the knee. All of these exercises can use loads in excess of that 1RM. And in fact, some exercises like the counter movement shrug and mid-thigh pull can use loads upwards to 140 and possibly 150% if individuals can kind of hold on to that weight and hold their posture. On the opposite side, or that in itself would allow us to get a lot of additional force benefits. So essentially just putting more force into the ground within the triple extension movement. Regarding the opposite side, exercises like a jump shrug and a hang high pull may allow us to achieve additional velocity benefits that we may not necessarily get with catching variations. With catching variations, there inherently has to be a deceleration period at the end of the second pull because we are transitioning to transitioning from concentric to eccentric movements. In addition to that, the pulling variations on that side of things allow us to accelerate through that triple extension movement to a greater extent, allowing us to get more or achieve higher velocities. That's system velocity, not just bar velocity. So obvious benefits there is that we're just moving faster. We're actually doing a project right now that's looking at kind of the entire spectrum of load from 20% all the way up to 140% with different exercises. So we should be able to provide kind of force and velocity characteristics as well as bar velocity characteristics of all of those exercises as well. That being said, when you train with catching variations, you're kind of limiting yourself on the loading spectrum. Probably the lightest loads that you would do maybe with a mid-thigh power clean or mid-thigh snatch of about around 50% of someone's max. And the whole issue with that, not issue, but mentality there is simply anything lighter than that, we may not be putting in max effort with the movement. So if it's kind of, half effort or partial effort, we're not going to get the same benefits as we would if we did full effort. Versus, and obviously the top end of the loading spectrum with that is 100% of 1RM because we can't lift more than our 1RM. Now, the training studies that we've done with catching and pulling, what we've ended up finding is that if you load specific to the phase, so if I'm focused on gaining maximal strength, I can obviously use loads or greater loads with pulling variations. And what we've ended up finding is that we're able to achieve greater force output, velocity outputs, better sprinting times, better change of direction times, and possibly even greater relative strength changes, even when we're testing with a catching variation. And what I mean by that is we did a pre-test with a power clean, and then we did a post-test with a power clean. And despite not catching for 10 weeks, we still improved that to a greater extent than just catching variations alone. So there's a lot to unpack there.
Get it. So you mentioned like mid-thigh pull and like jump stroke, this kind of stuff. And I know that there's a research talk about like force velocity profiling for like weightlifting derivative. So, like, if I'm training, like, let's say, a basketball team, and at what time of the year we should, like, do, like, jump stroke, and what time of the year we should probably implement some of the, like, catching phase, or, like, like, heavier, like, weightlifting movement in their program.
Yeah, sure. I think it's all going to be phase dependent on what you're working on, number one. So if we're talking about a general strength phase where we're prescribing, 3 sets of 5, we have a broad spectrum that we can use. Our 2 goals during a general strength phase are going to be increasing force production, so kind of our ceiling of force, but also to start to increase rate of force development characteristics. So the answer to that question is there's probably going to be a combination of exercises that you're going to be using. So one thing that I would caution people is that the higher the reps get with a catching variation, the worse the technique can get as well. Unless you're going to be using cluster sets, which is, having a short rest period in between repetitions. That being said, the pulling variations are probably if I'm programming, are going to be our foundation. They're going to allow us to achieve more force production during this general strength phase that we're talking about. But as the reps continue to get lower, I'll start to incorporate catching variations, one, to provide a varied stimulus, but 2, to be able to work on that skill, but also the intent of the movement. So if people know that they have to elevate the bar to a higher position to perform a power variation, or if we're doing a full catch variation, it just has them put more force into the bar to allow the bar to get elevated to the height that it needs to be. I would always recommend that if within a general strength phase that you're probably going to have a combination of both heavy and lighter exercises. So in this case, our pulling variation is going to be kind of our primary force exercise, where we have, loads in possibly in excess of 100% of 1 RM with a pull. And then with a catching variation, you're probably going to be a little bit lower on the spectrum, where you're going to be 60, 70%, or maybe 80, depending on what exercise variation we're using. So the answer is you can use both of them, and it's just a matter of what the goals of the specific phase are, and just understanding that each exercise kind of falls into the category of kind of a strength speed or speed strength type exercise, depending on how we load it.
So does that mean, like, can I put it in this way? Like, if I want to, like, train strength, like speed strength, I either, like, I can choose, like, whatever movement it is, as long as it's in this, like, the velocity zone.
Right. So if I'm going to program a speed strength type exercise, I'm focused more on the velocity side of things and using lighter loads to move quickly. So if I wanted to use a counter movement shrug with really, really, really light loads of, 20, 40, 60% of 1 RM, I certainly can do that, but that exercise is not primarily made to, I shouldn't say made, but it's not going to be our primary exercise for that characteristic. Now, if I'm using something like a jump shrug, that's a different story, because we're going to be having really light loads and moving very ballistically. So, and not, jumping as high as possible. So the way that I kind of shift things is that the catching variations are somewhere in the middle. If I'm using really light catch variations and then high velocity variations with pulls, that's going to be more of an emphasis on speed strength. So an exercise like a hang power clean or a hang power snatch or something like that, where you're 60% or something like that on the lower end of that optimal power range, if you will. But then obviously using jump shrugs, hang high pulls down in percentages of 30, 40%, then you're going to be certainly with a speed strength emphasis.
Cool. So next thing I kind of want to talk about like long-term athletic development. And do you like train young athletes, or do you teach young athletes weightlifting and weightlifting derivative?
I certainly think you can. I personally don't work with youth athletes. I mean, we could consider younger athletes in high school, where they're 14, 15 years old when we first get them, but even younger than that. I would say when you're training a youth athlete, the primary goal is to get them to handle their body weight and move in space well. Before you would start to load them. Technique is always going to be king, and if we teach them early, it'll make the rest of their development a lot easier. So ingraining good technique first is going to be beneficial. That being said, there's a really good paper by Stephanie Morris in Strength and Conditioning Journal that talks about implementing weightlifting movements as part of a kind of a long-term athlete development model. And she followed the same kind of method that we do, in that your traditional type movements, your squats, presses, pulls are going to be your foundation, but starting to incorporate pulling variations that are going to be simpler and easier to learn kind of serves again as your foundation before you start to introduce catching drills and turning over the bar. So there's no reason why youth athletes cannot learn weightlifting movements. They certainly can. Elizabeth Ohler's doing some good stuff in that regard. And I know there's a number of other people around the world that are still incorporating weightlifting variations with youth athletes as well.
When I teach like my basketball team, which they're in high school athletes, I also teach them like hang high pull or like power clean, that kind of stuff. And they respond to me that after they train the high pull and like the power clean, they actually like jump higher.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it just teaches an explosive movement that they may not necessarily have been given before. And anytime we introduce something novel to an athlete, they usually respond pretty well.
Yeah. So like if it's like weightlifting versus like loaded jump, like how would you like teach? I mean, how would you put it in the program? When to use weightlifting and when to use like loaded jump?
So this is an age-old question of should we use weightlifting variations or should we just only use loaded jumps? The answer is you can use both. No, we don't need to make this black and white. Both of them are just tools within our coaching toolbox. So something like a hex bar jump or a trap bar jump has its benefits. The obvious benefits that the weight is surrounding us. So the center of mass is more local, but that type of exercise may be high on the velocity side of things. However, from a force standpoint, it may also be limited, because when we're doing loaded jumps, we're probably not going to have, we're not going to load them super heavy, because the highest benefits that we can get are going to be with lighter loads. That being said, with something like a jump shrug, and we did a study on this, the jump shrug compared to a jump squat and a hex bar jump, what we ended up finding is that the jump shrug produced the greatest force output, or force at peak power, compared to the hex bar jump and jump squat that ended up having the highest velocities. So we consider a jump shrug an exercise that's going to be kind of the fastest or most ballistic weightlifting derivative, because you're actually jumping with the bar. It's almost like a half weightlifting derivative, half loaded jump. if that's the fastest, what we do have to come to the realization is that other loaded jumps and even unloaded jumps are going to be moving faster. So in this regard, you would consider a weightlifting derivative with a jump shrug as kind of your strength speed exercise, whereas your loaded jump and unloaded jumps are going to be more speed strength exercises. So where do they fit? Again, is the athlete competent when it comes to the weightlifting derivative? If not, you can teach them to be competent with it, or you can incorporate a loaded jump, assuming that you can still achieve the same goals that you're looking for. Again, loaded jumps, whether it's a hex bar jump or whether it's a jump squat, what have you, there's a time and a place, but it's not always the be-all, end-all, and no exercise is the be-all, end-all.
Cool, man. Love it. Love the way you answer it. So next thing I want to talk about is like eccentric training. I know there's a lot of like coaches talk about eccentric training. So why should we focus on eccentric?
Simply, we need to be able to put the brakes on. And there's a lot of other benefits in terms of kind of preferential recruitment of kind of type 2 fibers, which are going to be our, our more fast twitch fibers. We can selectively recruit those to get additional benefits. We can get some increases in shortening velocity by stretching out the fascicles of the muscle a little bit more. The neural drive is obviously going to be beneficial there when it comes to what we're recruiting in the concentric side of things. So from a stretch shortening cycle standpoint, we should be able to benefit the stretch shortening cycle by increasing the force that we're producing during the eccentric portion, which can then enhance the concentric portion. So there's a lot of different benefits that we can get from eccentric training. But simply put, we need to be able to stop ourselves before we can actually start ourselves.
So there's like accentuated eccentric loading and like tempo eccentric loading and like a lot of different kinds of like eccentric training. So I know you had research on like from the begin and from the novice and to like the elite. How should we put it and when should we put on different like eccentric training?
Again, it's based on the characteristics of the individual. I think there's a lot of people that can benefit from tempo type training. Obviously slowing down during the eccentric part of things, but there's different types of tempo training. If we simply just go down eccentrically with a really heavy load, also known as a negative, we're not performing the concentric side of things. That you can get a lot of eccentric and postural strength benefits from that. But that being said, you're not combining it with the concentric side of things. So again, there's a time and a place for something like that. And someone who is really weak eccentrically can benefit from negatives. Now, another method of tempo is increasing the volume that we can end up training with. So in this case, you're performing the eccentric side of things to a tempo, but still performing the concentric side of things. Downside of that method is that we can't use as heavy as a load as we would if we were just doing negatives. So it challenges you eccentrically and concentrically because of the amount of fatigue that's going to come from that. Beginners can certainly benefit from doing tempo training, especially because it helps them develop the brakes a little bit more and be able to slow down their momentum, handle heavier loads, increase that recruitment of type 2 motor units. Other methods such as like a flywheel inertial device, so a K-box or Kratos flywheel, something like that, is certainly going to be beneficial because it's also self-limiting. The thing about a flywheel device is that it's a closed system. What you put into it is what you have to accept. given the fact that, if we think about just a regular yo-yo, if we throw down a yo-yo really hard, it's going to come back really hard, unless you were one of the cool kids that had, a sleeper yo-yo that stayed down at the bottom until you pulled it back up. But the idea with a flywheel is that we have to be able to accept an external force based on what we create. So again, the harder we push, the harder it's going to kind of pull us down and have us slam on the brakes. Going to kind of AEL and accentuated eccentric loading, that's again an entire spectrum, because you can have a really heavy load eccentrically. I've seen 120, possibly 130%, but at that time, what we need to question is, are we disrupting the normal mechanics of the movement before performing the concentric side of things? So again, based on John Weigel's dissertation and kind of definition of accentuated eccentric loading, is that we should have a load in excess of our concentric side of things. The weight should fall off instantaneously, but we should also be able to continue with our normal movement mechanics while still resisting the load eccentrically. We can also have submaximal AEL, where we have something like dumbbell jumps, and lowering ourselves down, kind of slamming on the brakes early, dropping the dumbbells, and then jumping as high as we can. So there's a combination of kind of, AEL, almost from a force velocity curve standpoint, with just those types of exercises. So where they all fit is going to be based on the athlete's relative strength, their competency with the movements, the season that they're in. So generally speaking, tempo type training is going to be farther away from the in-season, just because it's going to increase the total time under tension and not necessarily benefit us from a stretch shortening cycle standpoint, because we're not pairing them as quickly as they would normally be paired. But also flywheel inertial training may be introduced as a novel training stimulus, a little bit farther off-season, moving towards in-season. AEL is going to be kind of your late off-season going into preseason and possibly in-season, depending on what kind of method you use. But again, this is all going to be based on the competency and the relative strength of each individual.
Cool. Love it. So how about like when we train like plyometric?
Where? The plyometrics we can use in a variety of places. Lachlan Wilmot has a really good kind of progression that we also included a modified version of in one of our papers. But the idea is that we want to be able to develop the eccentric portion of the movement first. So again, being able to stop ourselves first. So the idea is that we need to develop the braking side of things before we can develop the propulsive side of things, before we can develop pairing eccentric and concentric. So this can start well in the off season, but at the same time, we just have to be cognizant of the extra load that we're adding to somebody. So anytime someone has to land from a box and be able to stop themselves, they're still accomplishing or performing eccentric work that we have to factor in when it comes to the overall volume load that the individual has to complete. So the way that we typically work things is that we may start with something as simple as a snap down, where we start in a very tall position on our toes and snap down to a kind of a semi-squat position and stop. You can do this bilaterally, unilaterally. This then progresses to dropping off of a box bilaterally, unilaterally, elevating that box. But then starting to develop the propulsive side of things, this can be something as simple as just a squat jump from, a static start, jumping to a box. We've also used kind of uphill jumps. Obviously not going to be a super steep hill. We're going to be, relatively flat, but being able to progress up that. Some people have used stair jumps. Just caution on that so you don't short it and, knock out any of your teeth. But you have the ability to start to develop that propulsive side of things. But then what becomes important is being able to pair the eccentric and concentric side of things. So starting with something simple as kind of pogo jumps or hops in place, then you can possibly start to add a barrier to allow yourself to get over that barrier. But eventually you're going to want to work to something where the eccentric stretch is going to be really fast. So things like drop jumps, depth jumps, and then gradually progressing them. And once you get really good at kind of the bilateral side of things, you can start to incorporate the unilateral side. So our progression is always bilateral to unilateral, but then progressing from developing the braking force first, followed by the propulsion, and then followed by pairing them together. Most of the time when you're doing plyometrics, you're probably going to start more in the off season and gradually work them into going into preseason. I would just caution people of adding these in season just because the central nervous system will not be happy with you. It's just a lot of extra volume, and the central nervous system fatigue is just really high, especially because they're already practicing. You're doing additional weight training sessions. But you can really start to develop some of those characteristics even at the end of a warm-up, where you're able to do some of that. But just understand that there's a time and a place for it, but we just have to be able to be cognizant of what else they're doing and how it can contribute to their overall volume load.
Cool, man. I actually had an iPad over here and a note on the other side, and I read a lot of paper about from yours, from talk about weightlifting and eccentric training. So I have the paper on the iPad and the notes on my right side, and just listen to what I say. It's awesome.
Glad it's been beneficial.
So, I kind of want to ask, if let's just say combine about everything, when we go to in season, what do you think is the best for just team sport athletes for the crazy schedule?
The crazy schedule, is get the best stimulus you can in the amount of time that you have. So, for example, when I'm working with volleyball players right now, and something that we have to deal with is that, they're going to be playing at least one midweek match during the season, and then possibly a tournament over the weekends. So I may only get them twice per week when it comes to an actual training stimulus. So what I have to do is figure out where they are in terms of their fatigue relative to what their baseline is. So if they play a Wednesday match, but then they play Friday, Saturday, and have off on Sunday, then I know Monday is probably going to be the only day that I can really load them at all. So at that point, I'm using that day as kind of their quote unquote heavy day, where they can still have a day of recovery before they have their midweek match. And then later on in the week, possibly on the Thursday, day after they would have a midweek match, we may do something like a med ball workout where all I'm trying to do is give them kind of a speed strength stimulus, but not to the point where I'm going to fatigue them too much so that they're tired for their match the following day. If anything, it just kind of primes the nervous system a little bit, and kind of maintains their low force, high velocity characteristics. So the other things that we start to incorporate in season with that is we may incorporate more partial squats, but are loaded really heavy. So they'll warm up doing full squats, but then their working sets are actually performed just concentric only partial squats. And then we may do a box jump to, again, maintain that propulsive ability, but also almost use it as kind of a potentiation complex, just to give them not necessarily a lot of fatigue, but just give them really a high force stimulus and really high velocity stimulus as well. So to answer your question, it's really what can you use with your athletes that won't fatigue them excessively because of all their practices and everything, but also still gives them a proper neural stimulus in season.
So you mentioned like you're gonna monitor their fatigue. How exactly would you do that?
Now again, this is it's not like I can go into their brain and figure out exactly where they are, but one of the tools that we use for monitoring is we use unloaded counter movement jumps every single week throughout the season. So when they come back on the Monday, assuming that we have a training session, is they'll go through their typical warm-up, and then I actually have them jump on force plates. Things that I'll be looking at are kind of their propulsion mean force, their propulsion duration. I'll look at their eccentric kind of braking rate of force development. I'll look at their force at zero velocity, or their peak braking force, how they stop themselves. So, and I'll look at other characteristics like what their modified reactive strength index is. So I get to see things like how long does their jump take, how much force are they actually producing, are they stopping themselves well, and are they stopping themselves quickly. So when I see what I've typically seen is when athletes are fatigued, they drop off in terms of their stopping force or their force at zero. Their eccentric braking rate of force development goes down. Their propulsion phase increases, so they're jumping slower. And depending on their force, they may not be producing as much force either. So ultimately what I'm trying to look at is a change in jump strategy based on fatigue. And well, peak power is beneficial, and I'll still look at it. We still need to know how they achieve that peak power. People look at jump height. Jump height is very variable because people may change their jump strategy to achieve the same jump height. So again, I'll look at jump height, but I'm more interested in how they achieved that jump height.
Cool. So that's probably like all the question I have for today. So appreciate it, man.
No problem. Happy to be able to get on here.
So last thing, and I'm gonna let you go, okay? What do you think is the future for like sports performance or like strength and conditioning?
That's a big question. I think we're still going to see a lot more things coming out on kind of characterizing certain exercises and where they fit. There's going to be a lot more research probably on eccentric training. I know there's still going to be a push with velocity-based training as well. But I still think that we're going to see, more research out there that's going to be more focused on integrating sports science into team sports, especially here in the U.S., because that is something that's been growing over the past number of years. So that's kind of my take. I think when it comes to eccentric training, we know that it works, but I don't think we do a very good job at implementing it. That's what I think we're going to see some big improvements on, hopefully.
Cool. So if there's like coaches interested in what we're talking about today, where can they reach out to you, or where can they find you?
Sure. Yeah, they can reach out to me here on Instagram, Dr. T Suchomel, or on Twitter, same tag, Dr. T Suchomel. But also my ResearchGate has all of our research kind of on there. So if you just type in, I think it's just either Tim Suchomel or Timothy Suchomel all of our research for the most part should be there. And if it's not, you should be able to contact me via any of those means, and I should be able to get it to you. So, again, hopefully this has been beneficial. I'm a very small cog in a very big wheel when it comes to, strength and conditioning and sports science. And of course, it takes a village, and there's a lot of people who have helped me along the way and continue to help me.
I think your research helps a lot, man. I learned a lot from your research. Really
that's more beneficial to me to hear that it has been beneficial to you, because I think there's a number of groups out there that kind of do research for the sake of doing research, but it's not necessarily as applied as it could be. Our goal with our research is to be able to apply our findings right away. So hopefully we continue to still do that.
Yeah, especially research on plyometric and eccentric training. That helps a lot. Really love it.
All right.
So I know you have a busy schedule, so appreciate for your time, man. And is it possible to invite you to do a second episode?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Appreciate it. See you, man.
All right, take care. Thank you.
Appreciate it. See you.